Okay, well, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Hope that you all have enjoyed the last couple of sessions and our time with Sam Wells and Azariah France Williams. They were just incredible. I thought it was such a wonderful message that each of them brought to us. We are honored to have you with us today for this session. Led by Susan Marquis of the RAND Corporation and assisted ably by former SEEP Network board member Carrie Kelly. We have a wonderful program on tap for you talking about old power, new power. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan. Enjoy this session. Thanks for being with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you all at the networking event tonight and then for our keynotes tomorrow. Thanks so much. And Susan, off to you.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Good to see everybody, sort of, at least a bunch of names, right? That's about the best we can do. I am joined by Carrie Kelly, longtime friend, longtime SEAT member. So I'm Susan Marquis, Dean of the Pardee Rand Graduate School and Vice President for Innovation at the RAND Corporation. I'm also a longtime parishioner and currently the Senior Warden at St. Augustine's by the Sea in Santa Monica, California. So, I'm pleased to welcome you to a discussion about shifting power in our world, communities, and churches, drawing on the ideas of Henry Timms as shared through a recent interview. We all sense that power is shifting in the world, the changing nature of governance and institutions to include the church, the increasing complexity of the problems we face, problems that are always changing, even as we can't see them in their entirety. And technology, of course, has changed everything. The network nature of the world, speed of communications, many voices being heard, and of course, the unintended consequences of misinformation, silos, loneliness in this screen-driven world, particularly during a pandemic. We live in a world where movements rise rapidly, going viral in an instant and forcing change with remarkable speed. There are surges of action, even as there is a falling away from traditional affiliations and commitments. So how do we navigate these seismic shifts? And what does the success or failure of faith-based institutions, of our churches, from around the globe to our local parishes, what does that look like in our world? Henry Timms is a leading expert on building movements and transforming organizations. He's co-author of the international bestseller, New Power. I'm going to do something because I'm an author as well. So I'm going to actually do this. Henry's not with us, but I'm going to share New Power. You want this book, just saying. This is been a really seminal book in talking about these seismic changes. But in addition to that, he is the co-founder of Giving Tuesday, which he did while he was head of 92nd Y. In New York City. We're going to hear more about that in just a moment. And he's president and CEO of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. So we'll be watching this video together. We're going to stop at several points. So the video that is about 30, 35 minutes, something like that. We have several stops and we're going to do discussions at that point. First as a full group, then we're going to do a breakout session, and then once again as a full group. So what we are trying to look for here is discuss how these ideas, what they are, how they may or may not apply to what we would like to accomplish in the future of our church lives and institutions. So John is with us. He's keeping everything going. So John, let's get started.
Welcome, everybody. And welcome to this conversation, Strategic Futures Initiative conversation with Henry Timms. There's so much to say about what Henry Timms has accomplished. He is currently the president of Lincoln Center. He was the director of the 92nd Street Y, which for those beyond New York, is tough to describe how important the role the Y is, the 92nd Street Y is, in the life of New York City. And then he's written a terrific book and done a lot of work about something he calls New Power. And we're going to talk about all that today. I mean, first to say, Henry, all of us, New Yorkers or not, are thinking and praying for the future of Lincoln Center and the arts. Y'all should know one of Henry's predecessors wrote a book. I think it was entitled, "You Should Have Turned Down the Job," or something like that. And so Lincoln Center was a complicated place before the pandemic, even more complicated now. And we're going to talk about that and what leadership means in this moment of transition. But Henry, welcome. Thanks for being with us this morning. We're really grateful for your time.
It's a real pleasure, and both as a proud New Yorker and as president of Lincoln Center and as the grandson of a vicar.
Oh.
I'm very pleased to join you today. When I got the job at the 92nd Street Y, I was the first non-Jew in 144 years to hold that post. And they called me up to ask me what religion I was. And I previously we always would have said Church of England, but I of course didn't realize that made sense. So that's when I found out I was an Episcopalian. So that was a very exciting day.
Well, you've got a number, I think, of vicars who are watching today, so you're in good company. Let's start with something remarkable that you launched at the Y, Giving Tuesday. It's now raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Countless organizations have used it, including our parish and many of the groups who are involved with this initiative. Talk about Giving Tuesday, how you came up with it, how you decided to give it away and not just make it a Y event. How do you think of this, and what made you think of doing it beyond just an organizational event?
We have been thinking a lot about the way how we think about communities of change, right? How we think about making changes. So Giving Tuesday grew out the 92nd Street Y, and the initial kind of idea was an obvious one, which was the Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Giving Tuesday. So after these days which are about consumption, a day which reversed the trend and made it more about philanthropy and compassion. That was the kind of framing idea. But I think what was interesting about the way that we approached it was we always had this idea of not owning it. So in my term, the old power way of thinking about the world, right? If you have an idea that and you're working at the 92nd Street Y, your job is to make it as valuable for the 92nd Street Y as possible and get as much credit as you can. So when we first launched the idea of Giving Tuesday, I pitched it, and I remember one of my board members saying, "This is great, but where does our logo go?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, look, is the giving, are we going to put the 92nd Street Y between the giving and the choosing?" I was like, "We're not going to put the 92nd Street Y logo anywhere. Because if we do, it won't scale. If we own this and it's our thing and nobody else has ownership of it, then it's going to go nowhere." So we designed the frame so it was extensible, so that people could grab Giving Tuesday and make it their own without having to ask for our permission, without having to give us credit, without really having to engage with us at all. And that was an experiment, but it was also an act of faith, in the sense that we thought that if enough good people around the world grab this idea, it will outweigh if there are any bad actors, they will fall by the wayside, because the quality of positive things which come about will happen. And so Giving Tuesday really spread like wildfire, because people could grab it and make it their own. And we designed it not like a franchise. It wasn't like you had to do it the same way. People would do Giving Tuesday in whatever way they wanted it to do. So we had faith groups who would do food drives and coat drives. We had kids like donating stuff. We had someone donate a kidney one year. I mean, so it's been, people just grab it and take it. I mean, and right now I was hearing about the Giving Tuesday Sierra Leone chapter, right, who's doing some amazing work and actually done some really interesting work around the coronavirus. And so if you just track back 8 years and think this idea that begins on the Upper East Side of New York is helping fight the coronavirus in Sierra Leone under the same brand, which has been essentially open source to good people everywhere to get behind. Giving Tuesday is an extraordinary story, I think, not about our particular skills and getting the ideas off the ground. It's a story about the desire for people to connect to things in a communal way, to find ways of, in a world in which we are so divided right now, to find those common threads and celebrate them. That kind of ritual is such an important thing. And so now Giving Tuesday has actually raised billions of dollars now. We did a COVID special earlier this year, which we'd never done before. And that raised half a billion dollars online alone. And it's now in 130 countries. I mean, it's just been, and I haven't done, the team who runs Giving Tuesday, led by Asha Curran, they spun off from the 92nd Street Y a year ago. And I haven't done much on the project for a long time, but it has been a remarkable thing to see.
Well, Sue, I want to talk more about the common threads that you just described, because it's so important at this moment. But so many of us who are watching this have tried to launch something new and maybe try to even give it away. What made the difference? I mean, the 92nd Street Y has incredible historic reach, but Giving Tuesday went well beyond what the Y had done before. What was the difference in moving it from something that the Y, as big as it was, gave away to something everyone adopted? What was the inflection point that you saw?
I think to some degree, look, I have one Giving Tuesday on my resume, not three, right? So I think there is, to some degree, it's very hard to, something of this scale is kind of, is lightning in a bottle. But ideas like this, I think, work on a regular basis. I'll give you another example, which is just relevant to this group. Particularly, we did another project based on the same design principles of the Y, which was called the Ben Franklin Clubs. Now, Ben Franklin he had an extraordinary man. He had a weekly meeting with friends and talked about virtues, what it was to be a virtuous life. So he would cycle through the 13 virtues that he thought were most important in the world, which are things like humility and other things. And this practice was essentially like a book club for morals. And so he would get together every week and he would use it to bring people together around virtues. So we brought this back. We reinvented the Ben Franklin circles. We called it Ben Franklin circles. And we reached out to people everywhere to say, would you like to launch your own Ben Franklin circle? And people all around the country started to do this in their own terms, to connect with their neighbors, to engage with different people. We saw faith groups do this. We saw local police stations do it with community groups to find common ground, because we essentially gave them, and if there's one kind of framing idea in our work, it's the idea of giving people the permission to engage in your mission on their terms. And I want to say that twice, just because I think it's the most important thing I've learned in recent years. Get people to engage in your mission on their terms. We are so used to getting people to be involved in our mission on our terms, right? So to take I get some privilege here as grandson of a vicar. You take your pew, you keep quiet, you sing in the right spots, you put your money in, you put your money on the plate, you pray at the right times, and you played essentially a role of very limited agency within a structure of an organization. And if we are providing that kind of opportunity to a generation of people who have been brought up expecting to shape the world in their own image, right? There's a disconnect in terms of the structures that we have and the appetites of the people we're trying to serve. And so we have an old power structure and a new power appetite. And so what we are always trying to do is create essentially ideas that were ownable by other people so they could take them and make them stronger, rather than simply be participants in the way we think the world should work.
So I want to talk about exactly what you just launched into, about old power and new power. Wonderful book, New Power. And we're going to show some of the diagrams that you've created to describe that. But church has a complicated relationship with power. How do you, as leader of the Y and now leader of Lincoln Center, there are many different ways you could do your job with transformation, maybe without focusing on power. What made you think about this dimension of the work and of transformation? Why did you begin to work on power?
I think that originally when we wrote a piece for Harvard Business Review, my colleague Jeremy Hymas and I, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, which was really trying to give a language to the shift that we were all recognizing, right? Everyone would see this was the time that kind of everyone was saying that Twitter had caused the Arab Spring, and there was a clear sense that there's something happening with technology that was changing some of the fundamental kind of architecture of how the world was working. And of course, since then, that's become ever more true, right? If you think about all the trends of our times, right? Election of Trump, election of Obama, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, March for Our Lives, Extinction Rebellion, these huge platforms supercharged by the participation of everyone. This dynamic, which is this kind of connected crowd shifting everything, was what we started talking about in terms of new power. That new power is a different way of exercising power. In the old power world, you were powerful because of what you could control, right? What you could download, what you could make people do on your terms. In the new power world, people are becoming powerful in a different way, which is they're powerful because they're creating this space for participation, which others will follow. And I'll give you a resonant and I think an alarming example. Think about the debate around vaccines right now. And think about how old power is failing and new power is winning. So old power, which is you have all these experts who have their peer-reviewed studies and have their high positions in authority in society and have their 8 degrees, right? They are saying vaccines need to be trusted and we need to take vaccines, and when the vaccine comes from the coronavirus, you ought to take it. And a year ago, when the WHO was talking about the biggest threats in the world from a health perspective, two threats of the top 10 they named. One was pandemic, two was vaccine hesitancy. And the reason they're so concerned about that is the anti-vax movement has done such an effective job of discouraging people of taking vaccines seriously. And anti-vaxxers are a new power phenomenon, right? There is not a kind of headquarters where the general secretary of the anti-vax movement releases their monthly journal, which explains what everybody should do. It's distributed. It's about people feeling part of something. It's about people having outsized roles to play. If any of you were to leave this call now and become an anti-vaxxer, it would actually be a very meaningful community experience, right? You'd start sharing content, people would retweet you, they'd say you're right, they'd encourage you, they'd invite you to a barbecue, you become part of a community group. There's actually a very powerful kind of leadership structure around something like the anti-vax movement, which speaks to the time, and it speaks to the idea that everyone now wants a bigger role to play, and they aren't simply used to, you know, doing their small part in someone else's show. And that, of course, is amplified by social media. So I think as we think about the difference between old power and new power, any organization, I think, is thinking about, okay, and it's certainly true of Lincoln Center, what is it in our old power that is valuable and should be sustained? So in the case of Lincoln Center, rigor, ambition, excellence, there's a whole set of things that we have based our reputation on. But equally, at the same time we are improving the strengthening the old power of our organization, we have to create the new power too. How is it we are allowing people to engage in our mission on their terms? How are we creating that broader space for people to engage in meaningful ways around the mission of Lincoln Center? So as we think about the future of the organization, I think this is certainly true of this group. I am not certainly advising we get rid of old power and, you know, crowdsource everything. But I think there is a balance between the old power world that we are also used to, and indeed many of us built our careers in, and an embrace of a new power world that actually acts very differently.
Well, so I want to talk you in both the HBR article and the book, talk about being bilingual and give examples that they're blending old power and new power, both models and values. I want to bring up, just because I think it's really helpful, the chart that y'all put together about old power, new power values. I just wonder if you want to say more about the distinction. I think I read that you said that old power is currency and new power is current.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think this is actually very useful, particularly for faith groups, right? The mindset on the left, these old power values, they supported generations of progress. And I'm not for a moment being normative here in the sense that these things are wrong, right? So particularly if you think about church, long-term affiliation couldn't have been more important, professionalism, discretion, you know, exclusivity, managerialism. This is how our structures behave. And what's challenging that so much now is that there's a expectation, or people are coming into churches having this idea around new power values, which is like, okay, how do we think about collaboration? How do we think about transparency? How do we think about a world that doesn't want to be a member of something for 35 years in a minimal way, but wants to be a big part of something right now? And there's a real clash between those two mindsets. And I'll give you a working example of that. If you think for a moment about your own congregation, and think for a moment about how you would feel about a teenager in the pews live streaming the service and commenting on it to their friends, right? How would you feel about that as a question? Now, I'm not suggesting there is a wrong or right answer to that question. I'm sure there would be a divergence of views amongst those on this call, but it would be an example of thinking about old power versus new power. On one level, you would say, well, this is very disrespectful. He or she is not paying attention. This is actually making light of something that they should be engaged in. This is a holy moment that should not be mediated by something fairly trivial, would be argument one. Argument two would be, I've just tripled the size of my congregation, right? Because there are 3 times as many people on Jim's Instagram account than there is in my pews, correct or wrong. And number two, I'm making this relevant in the new way. Number three, the gospel has existed this long because it works out how to spread in new ways, right? So you could see there will be different answers to that question, but essentially that is a question about power. If I frame it in that way, who is going to hold the power in that context? Is it the established norms of a church, which is based on silence and respect in many cases? It's a certain piece of the church, not all of the church, of course. Or does the power shift to the person in the pews who has become the broadcaster, who has mediated the mediator, right? Who has taken the power which came from on high through the individual at the front of the church, and it's been mediated again before it gets to a broader community. And how do we feel about that? Those kinds of questions seem to me at the heart of how old power and new power needs to be navigated. And the big danger for the old power world is not taking this seriously enough. The big danger is that people will confuse this conversation and think it's something fairly peripheral, it's not meaningful, it's not going anywhere serious. And I think that's a huge mistake, because if you think about this is true of the performing arts, and I would say of the religious world too.
All right, so welcome back. This is our first break. Obviously, there's a bunch of new ideas out here. I just want to highlight a few. I should say what we're going to be doing is Carrie's watching the chat. We'll bring that in. We're just going to do a few minutes of discussion to kind of follow up on what we just heard. So first, Henry's talking about Giving Tuesday, the anti-vaxxers, Black Lives Matter as an example of new power. And it's a fascinating idea. Giving Tuesday, first of all, I hadn't realized he invented, or they came up with Giving Tuesday. Talk about a wonderful, powerful idea. An important point Henry makes right up front is that if we own it, which would be my instinct, frankly, that we invented it, we're going to own it, raise the profile of my organization. But if we own it, you can't scale it. So that's a really big idea there. We need to talk about how we might leverage that idea. The second thing is, and this is really important for the church, this idea that we might want to give, or new power is about giving people permission to engage in your mission in their terms. And so he used the example of the teen in the pews live streaming the service, or doing TikTok videos of the service. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it violating the norms, not how we behave? Or what is it that's actually going on there? So I think let's start there. Carrie, are we seeing anything in the chat now that you think is helpful? What are we seeing?
Yeah, people are starting to imagine, well, first of all, there have been some fun comments about teens in the pews, which all by itself is something new and different, teenagers in the pews. But I think it's sparking people's imagination, thinking about somebody live streaming. That was such a graphic example, having somebody live streaming during worship. And it's this sort of hybrid scenario that I think Henry is challenging us to think about.
So one of the, I'm seeing a comment, sorry, I took it seriously when you asked about that T word.
Yeah.
It's hard to be facetious in chat, although I try it a lot, as I was doing with our control room earlier. But right, we don't often see teens in our pews necessarily. One example I'll think of how things have changed, this idea of new people. I saw that come up, new people on the vestry, as though that's a bad thing. We're going to pick up on the issue of institutional decline in the next segment. But, oh, I love that. Sorry, I'm interrupting myself, Carrie. We just named an associate of digital ministry. That is fantastic. And people are using live chat during the traditional service. So Carrie, have you seen that in any of the services you've participated in, particularly during COVID?
No, but I was having a conversation with a rector earlier today about this very thing, that we may at some point, here's a scenario that could be in our future, along with your altar guild and your vergers, you may have your digital media team during service who's engaging in tweets and live stream. And in this way, you have people engaged digitally, engage being the operative word, not just passive consumers of a broadcast service.
Well, oh my gosh, there's so much coming in on chat. Sorry, I'm getting wonderfully distracted. It's not a bad thing. I noticed a comment in there, and this picks up a little bit about what you're talking, this sort of hybrid thing. Younger generations are looking to be part of, it's moving, a whole community, not just a youth group. And that goes back to a point Henry made, I think, that everyone wants a bigger role to play, not simply play a small part in someone else's show. And I think many of us who've been active in the church, we kind of like the show of the church. We like smells and bells and pageantry. I think of our friend Carrie and I both know Steve Wilson from back in the day, Carol Oakes on, she does as well. And, we kind of like all that. We like that show, but then you have to also get people so they're not just stuck in their pews. They're not really just there to be the audience for the show. And that's a real transition for the church. I want to bring up something else that Henry talked about. He talked about you're not trying to toss out all things old power. You know, there are some things in old power that could be, should be retained more broadly. For example, rigor, discipline, and the like. He, in another interview I saw, maybe it was with you, Carrie, you know, you don't want, when you get an appendectomy, you're not interested in a new power surgeon. You want someone who actually has depth, actually knows how to do what they're doing, as opposed to crowdsourcing your appendectomy. So I think it's an interesting point. What elements of old power really need to be retained, and what are those elements of and values of new power that we need to navigate and even leverage? So these are some of the points. I'm going to move us back into the rest of the video, because then after this next segment, we'll move into breakout groups and you all will be able to discuss directly with each other a set of questions that I'll propose you start with.
People are always worried about the performing arts in a way they're always worried about religion, right? It's desperate. But actually, that's not really what they're worried about. They're worried about performing arts organizations, and they're worried about religious organizations. There's actually a very good argument to say that right now, and I'm being slightly flippant, but not entirely, you could argue right now is the golden age for religion, and it's the golden age for the performing arts. And I'll make the argument like this. We've never had more people creating art right now, and we've never had more spiritual people in the world than we do right now, in terms of people expressing spiritual things. Right. Are either of those expressions, artistic or spiritual, going through the same pipes they went through in the 20th century? No. Does that make them less valid? Question. So I think that's an interesting frame for this, which is, in a way, if you think about either religion or the arts, but from a supply side perspective, you've got more content than ever. The question is around quality, and the question is around direction. But I think that's the positive spin.
So y'all have done a constellation of an analysis of new power, old power organizations, new power values and models, old power values and models. How would you give us a landscape, a constellation view of how we should understand this? And we can talk through it. There are a couple, I think, fascinating examples that you've offered of new and old power, but how would you help us understand examples of both?
So this was when you write for Harvard Business Review, you're legally bound to create a 2x2 matrix. Otherwise, they won't publish it. So we did this. So this is tracking two things. On the vertical axis, we're looking at your model. So do you have an old power model where essentially you download your information to the world and it's consumed by a fairly passive recipient? Right. Or do you have a new power model where you're creating space for people to collaborate and share and participate? And on the horizontal axis, we're looking at values. So do you have kind of old power values where it's very closed up, very confidential, very hidden, very much about expertise? Or do you have new power values where you're much more about transparency and you're favoring the wisdom of the crowd? So with those two dynamics, I'll just walk through these four quadrants. The castles, old power meets old power, right? So the Nobel Prize is the best example. Small group of experts behind closed doors decide who the world's greatest, physicist is, and then hands out the prize, right? It's completely old power in how it's designed. But interestingly, like an Apple is an old power organization. It's a new technology company, but they're very closed up. They're very secretive. You could, if you were being provocative, say that Apple has actually stolen quite a lot of pages from your playbook. If you think about the experience of where the Apple logo is exactly where the crucifix would have been. There are certainly some very spiritual notes in terms of how they're thinking about that product, and it downloading from the geniuses in Cupertino who work out how our lives should be. They aren't actually offering us much agency. And that's an important example because it shows us that you can be an old power organization and thrive, right? Apple's obviously very successful. We're seeing then in the cheerleaders quadrant, we're seeing lots of organizations who are still old power in their models, but are wrapping new power values around that model. So Patagonia is a good example. They're a retailer. They sell clothes and shoes. But interestingly, they're thinking about their consumers as activists. They're building lots of opportunities for people to advocate and mobilize around the brand. They've been very transparent about their supply chain, even bits of it which are problematic for them. So they've started to kind of talk the talk of new power, without walking the walk. More and more danger actually is in this quadrant now, because so many people now are using the language of the crowd and the language of activism and actually doing nothing about it. So there is more risk here than when we first wrote about this. Top right, we would call the crowds, when new power meets new power. So, you know, you can see we wrote this in 2014 and all it had on there was Occupy. And since then, think of all the things you would add at the top right of the map. You know, kind of the stories of our time have been these social movements, which have been hashtag movements, which have led to very meaningful change. But you also see things like Airbnb, organizations like that, who I think have actually worked out how to build a new power model with new power values. So they've done that in a kind of confederated way, but in terms of actually really distributing agency around the crowd. And then finally, the top left, which is, we've called the connectors. We actually updated this in the book to call the co-opters, which is people who have new power models but old power values. And this is increasingly proving the most dangerous place to be. Also one of the most powerful. So Facebook is the best example. Facebook has the best new power model we've ever seen, right? So 2 billion people a month now. Facebook is nothing without us. It is nothing without the contribution of data we all make to it. We are living our lives on this platform because we're so desperate to participate in it, because it allows us this chance to feel engaged and important and validated and notified. And yet, for all the language of community and the promise of democracy that that organization has fostered, their value proposition is very old power. It's closed up, it's hidden, the algorithm is basically directed by one man as to how the world should change. And we know that impacts not just our elections and our democracies, but it will change your life today. And that's not overstatement. Facebook has the power now that is actually shaping so much of our lives. So there's the kind of that quadrant becomes the kind of the co-opter quadrant. So of course, the interesting question for a group like this is, as you think about your own work, where would your organization be today? And where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And how are you going to get there? And I would hazard a guess that no matter what the distribution might be in this group, there would be no one who wants to be in the same place in 5 years' time.
Right, and that's really the focus and the point of our conversations together. In the book, you talk about organizations that have blended old and new power successfully, some of which frankly surprised me. The examples you used, the NRA, TED Talks, neither one had I analyzed in the same way that you presented it. Talk about what it means to be bilingual, and I'd love to hear more, I mean, from your, and you can add to that list of examples of organizations that are successfully making this journey to a new place and this bilingual world.
Well, those are really helpful examples because they both show, I think, how important it is to have an old power flank and a new power flank. So let's start with TED, which is in a way the easy one. So TED is one of the most exclusive conferences in the world, right? If you want to go to TED, you have to apply online, then you have to pay $35,000, and then you have to be selected. So, and then once you get there, you get VIP entrance, you get corned off from everybody else, you're with the chosen few behind the closed doors. Like I know at least 2 New York billionaires who were seriously concerned that they weren't going to make TED, right? So that is true old power, right? They've got all the power, they decide who's coming and who's going, right? They also have an amazing new power model. So alongside with the old power model, which is this very exclusive conference, by making TED Talks free, which was a controversial decision at the time, by encouraging people to run their own TED events, these TEDx events, which means you could run an event at your church if you applied. They've distributed so people everywhere can do their own version of TED Central, but in a way that actually is a very new power way, and then some hidden strengths of the TED brand, and particularly their translation. They have a volunteer translation group of people all around the world who turn all these TED Talks into other languages to expand their reach. So they have both an old power model and a new power model, and those two things don't just live alongside each other, they reaffirm each other. The more that TED Talks get shared, the more exclusive the event becomes. So they've worked out this great trick of their exclusivity is feeding their inclusivity and vice versa, right? Which is a really neat trick to pull off. And the surprising other example of that would be the NRA. And the NRA, of course, have an amazing old power model. They are very good at scaring politicians, right? The NRA actually grade people, right? They say we're going to give you a B or an A or a C, depending on how you, politician X, are voting against the things we care about. And any politician, the idea that they're going to get downgraded by the NRA can actually change outcomes. But the other thing the NRA does, which is so interesting, is they have spent years investing in this grassroots movement across the country, which is not owned by the NRA, but lives alongside it, which means they have this intensity that they are able to draw upon when the moment calls. So people keep saying, why does gun control never get passed in this country when 7 out of 10 people believe in gun control? Well, the reason is because the 3 who don't are much more passionate about this than the others, right? So what the NRA has is intensity. And one of the interesting things about new power, if you think about this a bit further, anyone who's succeeding in the world right now is often finding ways of developing intensity. And obviously, I'll give you some examples. Donald Trump is a perfect example of this, right? For his favorables were always lower than Hillary's. His favorables are looking worse than Biden's right now. But I'll make a prediction right now that the big surprise is going to come after the election. It's not going to be about favorables. It's going to be about intensity. That Biden will be more popular, but the popularity will be thinner. So actually, Trump will end up with a much more intense base who will mobilize much more for him. And I think that's very dangerous for the Biden campaign. And we see this throughout the world. You look in Brazil right now, Jair Bolsonaro, who's essentially a throwback, military figure, very old power values. He came to power because he worked out how to build this intensity. He had what he called this invisible army of WhatsApp people on WhatsApp who were mobilizing around his campaign, not tied to his campaign. So the interesting lesson in all these things is these are all organizations or individuals who have living alongside their old power world, a new power crowd that feeds them and supports them. So the interesting question for the church and for faith leaders is, what's your new power crowd? How are you thinking about building that? How is that living alongside the work that you're doing? And I think that's a really important and interesting question.
All right, so welcome back. I happen to agree with that last question as an important question that Henry just raised. And so what we're going to do now, we're going to go into breakout groups in just 1 second. John, let me give a couple of questions. And it picks up on this thread a little bit that we see. What if we thought about our church as a movement rather than an institution? So the question is, what is the church's new power crowd? We've talked about looser affiliations, but greater participation, participating in your own terms. How might we all think about building that new power crowd in our church while maintaining the core values of the church and integrating those values? And what is it that needs to be protected and retained? And how do we change our metrics? How do we get away from the physical building, weekly attendance, and pledges into new ways of measuring the influence and scale of spreading the word? So John, if you want to send us out into breakout rooms, we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back. Everyone's come back in. We're about to go ahead and start the video. I can see we got 75 back in. That's pretty good. We're going to talk about the idea, or we're going to hear about shapeshifter leaders.
I'm interested in using examples from history and what you described as a manual for our own work. So how would you, if everyone, and we have folks who are deans of seminaries and heads of congregations around the country and bishops who are part of this initial group, and then what we do will go out to the entire Episcopal Church. If we were to take steps forward toward the kind of blending that you described, what's your advice? What's the manual you would advise us to write to help people do this?
I think there's nothing there's nothing which is better than trying things. The great danger with new power work is it's old power practices, even ones that are declining, are often not very risky, right? So you could certainly, and I've run some old and prestigious organizations, not as old as prestigious as the ones represented on this call, but what happens is people would much rather have slow and gradual, almost imperceptible decline without risk than they would small amounts of risk right now. And so the trick for any organization is actually you have to make space for experimentation and trying new things, and that's really hard for organizations. And it's true of Lincoln Center. Like, everything we do is the best. That's kind of what the brand's all about. And so when you say we've got to try this new thing we've never done before, it might not be the best, right? It might not work out. It might go wrong. So I think that the permission to try small things that might teach you something. This is a muscle you have to strengthen, right? That's the most important idea. Was Aristotle said that excellence is not an act but a habit. You know, we are what we repeatedly do. So you have to start strengthening your new power muscle. That's how TED got good at this. It's how the NRA got good at this. It's how we got good at it, right? You should start doing this day after day after day as number one. And then number two, which I think is really important, particularly for people in positions of old power, is how valuable it is when you signal you're prepared to try things in new ways, right? So actually the signal, we call this the shapeshifter, this character inside organizations who has a lot of old power credibility, who starts doing things in new power ways, because it buys cover for everybody else who want to then start making these shifts. And so I'll give you an example from my work at the Y. Perhaps one of the most effective new power practitioners was Rabbi Peter Rubenstein, who was, you must know Rabbi Rubenstein, who 50 years he was in the pulpit at Central Synagogue. I mean, he was, you know, he's one of the most revered rabbis of his generation and the one before it. But he's in his 70s now, and he came to the Y because, interestingly, when he and I first talked, he wanted to experiment outside the typical old power structures. He wanted to try new things. So when he was at the Y, he built things like a High Holidays at Home, which is a Facebook high holiday. So it allowed people to observe the high holidays online through meeting digital rabbis, through going through this kind of 2-week course before the holidays to learn about them, and then to follow up afterwards. So he created this very vibrant Facebook community, which wasn't just a live stream, but actually a communal experience around the holidays. And the most interesting story which came from that project, there was someone who was who had joined one of these groups and was saying, talking about growing up and having not ever gone to services, and then just admitting in a passing way that they were homeless. And then 2 people on the group offering to give them somewhere to stay. And what Rabbi Rubenstein said about that, which was so interesting, is he said, if that same person had tried to come into the synagogue on the high holidays, number one, there wouldn't have been space for them. Number two, we probably wouldn't have found out they were homeless. They actually had a holier experience as part of this Facebook group than they would have done in real life. And what was so interesting is, as soon as Rabbi Rubenstein started to try things like this, it shifted the whole organization, because he had unimpeachable Jewish credentials, which I as an Episcopalian obviously did not have. And it stopped the conversation being about, there are people who feel out of touch and old who are the problem, and the 23-year-olds are the answer. And it told a very different story, which is leaders who would reimagine themselves can be more effective. And his high holiday, he did a video of a high holiday song that he commissioned, getting essentially crowdsourcing the commission with Jewish leaders around the world, Jewish communities around the world. He's reached 9 million people now through the videos he's created around the high holidays. And he worked out that that was many multiples of all of the people he'd ever connected with in his entire 50 years in the pulpit. So you realize that your old power position, anyone who has a position of old power authority, has a terrific opportunity to actually open the gates of new power in a way which is encouraging and also compassionate. Because you're going to make more mistakes in this world, but none of those mistakes will be as big as the inevitability of further decline, which is the biggest danger to institutions right now.
So what you said, a number of things today that we can engrave on our figurative walls, and the notion that the mistakes we make in trying things will be less than the mistake of doing nothing, I think is, again, one of our motivating factors in doing this work. I want to ask you about Lincoln Center, but one more kind of current events analysis question. In the book, you all talk about Black Lives Matter from the perspective of a couple of years ago. Obviously, this year with the murder of George Floyd has been one in which many of us have been involved in the next stage of Black Lives Matter. What's your sense of this now, having watched the organization and what's happened over this summer? Do you have an analysis or an observation about how that organization continues to change as the movement has grown?
Yeah, and I think the design choices the co-founders made have been so powerful and have really given them such resilience as a movement. So they always frame Black Lives Matter as not leaderless, but leaderful. The framing wasn't there as no one in charge here. Just because you don't see an all-powerful man at the heart of this doesn't mean it doesn't have leaders, right? That wasn't what they were pushing back against. And they've actually had a real challenge, Black Lives Matter, right? And the co-founders talk about this idea that actually on a regular basis, it's often the case that the movement starts getting associated with powerful male individual, rather than actually what they were always trying to do, which was to focus and base the movement around the experiences of queer Black women. That was always the framing idea of Black Lives Matter. And so what I think has been so powerful, if you think about how extensible and how generously that movement was designed so everyone could own it. So you can see now anyone from the biggest corporations in the world through to people on the block at 7 o'clock every evening around from my house can grab that logo and grab that cause and make it their own, because they had designed that to allow everyone to participate in meaningful ways. The great sadness, of course, is that it's necessary that that participation exists, right? We would rather that this not be such a tragedy and such an ongoing trauma to this country, and especially to the Black population in this country. But I think their achievement, their leadership achievement, is just remarkable as something. And I think the big question is now going to be, as it is often the case with New Power, the question is going to be not are the signals resonant, because the signals are clearly resonant, but will we lead to structural change, right? That's the great danger, is true of it's no coincidence that the Women's March, one of the biggest protests in history, came very shortly before the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, right? So the Me Too movement, for all of its resonance, there are still very real concerns that particular topic will go the wrong direction, will be a backlash rather than anything else. So I do think that part of the challenge now is actually ingraining some of these changes in policy and outcomes. And I think that's often an old power job now. So I think a lot of the thing you're seeing now is that are the old power systems actually taking a relay from New Power, right? Relay from Black Lives Matter. So, okay, then what am I going to change in my own organization to help cement these changes? That actually now I think is the responsibility of old power leaders. And that relay of change from New Power to old power, I think, is really important, because people often try and undermine these movements because they expect them to be everything. They say, well, you know, where's your perfect policy platform? And actually, so often the jobs of some of these movements, and you could certainly put the climate work in the same category. The job of the movement is to open up the window, open up the cultural aperture, so then policymakers can go through it, right? There have been lots of smart people working on climate forever, and those moments when things shift to allow progress, I think we'll start to see that as you think, and I think so rightly, as you think about the skill set of people in your community and what they're going to need to be good at for the next decade. Right. We know they're good at old power, and that's going to be important. So the question is how much time they're going to spend getting good at new power. And so that leadership, I think, is a really important thing to be thinking through, and one in which, you know, your network in particular could have such an impact. Well, I'm very pleased to be with you today, and I'm pleased to have a moment to spend time with your community. We welcome all the prayers we can have in the performing arts right now. So this is a good group for that. And I will just end by saying the question, I'm very happy this book has taken me many places to talk to many groups of people, and there's only one question that I couldn't answer at the time, and I still can't answer, which came from your community. So I'll end with that. I was doing a talk and I was, you know, giving clever answers about the blockchain and geopolitics and shifting, you know, appetites of young people. And it was a Union Theological seminary, and I was asked, tell me, has this changed your relationship with God? And that was the one question I couldn't answer then, still can't answer now. So that shows you, it shows you there are limits to power.
So on that note, we're about to wrap up this session. The chat has been terrific. So we've already shown new ways of communicating works pretty well. I want to thank everyone for joining. I do recommend the book. Carrie Kelly is going to attach the Harvard Business Review article in chat, so you can get a copy of that if you'd like to see it, which is a good summary of the book. And there's been a ton of great ideas, incredible engagement and energy in this. So I want to thank everyone. I know we are supposed to wrap up now. And so, Carrie, do you have anything else you'd like to add? Just
thanks for the great chat. There's some wonderful comments here, and hopefully you all will read the article as soon as I can get it attached, and keep thinking about new power.
Yeah, and taking risks, working against decline, and really looking for how do we bring in new people and new audiences on their own terms. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks.